The Boca Raton Historical Society and Museum, founded in 1972, is a nonprofit membership organization dedicated to preserving the past to enrich the future. The Historical Society is building a legacy in our community by collecting and sharing our local history. The current project is documenting the Jewish history of Boca Raton.
I'm Bill Gralnick. I came to Boca Raton in 1990.
It's very nice to have you with us this morning, Bill. I'm Sandy Altner, and I am a volunteer interviewer with the Boca Raton Historical Society and Museum. And today is November 18th, 2015, and we are at Lynn University, where we are in the beautiful studios of the International Communications Department, where we are recording this interview. I'd just like to tell you that I'm going to read something from the Congressional Record, Extensions of Remarks, Volume 152, Part 7, where it is recorded that on May 25, 2006, the Honorable Robert Wexler of Florida in the House of Representatives addressed the Speaker with the following words: "I would like to recognize the retirement of a great leader in the American Jewish community, the Southeast Regional Director of the American Jewish Committee, AJC, William B. Gralnick. For the past 3 decades, Bill Gralnick has championed Jewish causes and promoted interreligious dialogue in South Florida. He has built bridges with the Christian and Muslim communities, advocated for strengthened U.S.-Israel relations, and combated anti-Semitism and intolerance in all its forms. He has brought South Florida law enforcement officials together with local clergy and arranged for exchanges between Israeli security experts and local police. The exemplary work of the AJC in South Florida is a testament to Bill's commitment, and I thank him for his unwavering dedication, spirit, and resolve." And we thank you as well.
God has an interesting way of keeping people humble. That was very flattering, and I appreciate it immensely. But my middle initial is A, not B. So, you know, there was just a little jab in there to make sure I remembered that what's important in life is other stuff, not accolades.
Can we start by talking a little bit about what the AJC is and what work it is that you came here to do?
Sure. The American Jewish Committee, which throughout much of its history was known as the best kept secret in Jewish life, is the oldest human relations agency in the United States, and I think therefore qualifies as the oldest human relations agency in the world. We were established in 1906. It's an interesting history. The three majors, the committee, the Congress, and the ADL, were each founded after a cataclysmic event in Jewish life. And for us, it was the Kishinev pogrom that brought together a group of mostly wealthy, mostly members of the grandees, if you will, people who lived in the Upper West Side of New York. And the name was probably a marketer's nightmare, because they said, what should we call ourselves? They said, well, we're a committee of American Jews. How about the American Jewish Committee? There's no magic to it at all. Committee has by far the widest range of activities. It believes that unless all people are safe, Jews will not be safe. Unless all prejudice is attacked, then anti-Semitism will have a broader base of people who are against it. The primary work of the American Jewish Committee, except on behalf of Israel, maybe even on behalf of Israel, is done through the universal community, the non-Jewish community, to bring the messages that are inherent in Jewish life, in Torah, Jewish values, to the broader world. We are by far the premier bridge to the non-Jewish world. In fact, one of our great leaders, may his memory be remembered for a blessing, Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum, was called by Time magazine the Jewish apostle to the Gentiles. That very much captures what the American Jewish Committee sees itself as. We've also been called the State Department of the Jewish community. The work is done through, of course, the headquarters in New York, but right after the Second World War, we started a chapter movement. At the time I left AJC, I was there for 33 years, we had 36 offices. We also have a series of offices in major capitals in Europe, so that what our policymakers and what our advocates are getting is from the grassroots, not from research or hearsay or anything other than people on the ground. And my career started in Atlanta. The 33 years were almost equally divided between Atlanta, Miami, and Palm Beach County in Boca Raton. The people up here began to feel that they didn't want to be represented by an office in Miami. And one of those people was somebody who I saw as a mentor. And he was on the National Board of Governors, and he began to lobby, if you will, to have an office put here. And my whole career was, here's a good idea, go implement it. I was sent to Atlanta to solve a problem. When I was in Atlanta, they sent me to Miami to analyze a problem. When I gave them the analysis, they said, that's great, go to Miami and do it. When we began advocating for a Palm Beach County office, they said, that makes sense, move. So here I was, starting in about 1990.
So in 1990, you went from Miami then to Boca Raton, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. What was Boca Raton in 1990 to you at that time?
Boca Raton was, I would say, beginning to become what it has become. It wasn't too long before 1990, and certainly not very long before the time I was in Miami, because I serviced this area from Miami, that you could meet people every day who remembered when Boca Raton did not go past where I-95 was. When I moved here, 441 was the end. None of the things that are out past Mission Bay were there. It was just all Everglades kind of stuff. And you've seen this steady march west. What had begun to happen in the early 1990s was a more rapid increase in the Jewish population. In the 1950s, Temple Beth-El was established. It was a Reform synagogue. It was the only synagogue. More and more Jews came primarily from the Northeast, primarily from New York, began to settle in Boca, and the community as an organization began to grow. Similarly, before the 1990s, the same thing that happened with the American Jewish Committee leadership here happened with Federation leadership. This community was serviced by the Federation of the Palm Beaches in West Palm Beach. And Rabbi Bruce Warshall, who was a professional at that federation, worked with a group of leaders in that federation who lived in Boca, and the rest is history. So by 1990, you had a growing Jewish infrastructure. You had a presence that was noticeable. And as Shakespeare once wrote, there lies the rub.
Mr. Gralnick, when was it that Boca Raton became attractive as a place for Jews to move to?
I think that some would tell you that Boca was always attractive, but it wasn't on the route map, if you will. If you don't mind a little geography and history, the Jews are an extremely mobile people. I don't know if it's exactly so now, but when I was at AJC, a valid statistic was that Jews moved more frequently than any other group in America. Jews moved on average of 5 times in their lifetimes. Most Americans, far fewer. So we knew of this place called South Florida primarily because there were many training camps down here that soldiers getting ready to go overseas in the Second World War trained at. Weather was good, property was cheap, great place to retire. And I-95 became, if you will, the Jewish immigration highway. Most of the initial immigration was into Miami Beach. It's only been historically very recently that the entire city council of Miami Beach was not Jewish. And interestingly enough, it was not a city that was particularly welcoming to Jews. It's long been reputed that Arthur Godfrey, who, my blessed grandmother loved, owned a hotel, the Kenilworth, that did not take Jews or other kinds of people either. There were restricted country clubs on Miami Beach where Jews were not accepted as members, but we sort of overwhelmed it, basically. I'm not sure the people who didn't want us saw it coming, and then all of a sudden we were all over the place. An interesting anecdote is that for a while I lived on the beach, and the city had gotten a historic renovation grant for a street called Espanola Way, which is a little area of Mediterranean Art Deco. And one side of the street was, half of the street was taken up with what used to be an old hotel, later became a youth hostel. So they used some of the money to begin sandblasting Lord knows how many layers of paint off it. And it became sort of like Vanna White was doing it. As they began to get rid of the paint, first you saw a G, and then an E, and then an N, and then a T, all the way down to Gentiles. And then, I don't know where the geniuses were, but it took them until they got to the O of the next word that somebody realized, oh my God, this says Gentiles only. And they stopped sandblasting and started painting. But that was Miami Beach in the 30s, 40s, 50s. The Jews began to move off the beach as West Miami began to grow, Kendall, and from Kendall to North Miami, and then began to move up the pike. There's such a thing in demography called a centroid, which is, if you remember the old protractor you used in math class, the centroid would be the point where the arithmetic center of Jewish life was. And the centroid moved from Miami Beach to Kendall to North Miami, and when I left AJC, it was already in Fort Lauderdale. And if not already, certainly within the next 10 or 15 years, as we have begun to leave Boca, move to Jupiter and even further, that I think the centroid will move up closer to West Palm Beach. So that's how we ended up getting here, on the way up the pike out of Miami. And that was greatly enhanced by the Mariel boat lift. That period of time, Jews scattered up 95, and that was the real explosion of population here.
So what year would you say it really started to become impressive, or in what period of time was it impressive? When did that transition start
Well,
from?
I would say all throughout the 90s, with that extra spurt after the Mariel boat lift, which really turned the beach and sections of Miami into a very dangerous place. And that wasn't why we came here. And by that time, we had certainly second generation and some third generation families. There were children in schools. So we moved.
When this area, the Boca Raton area, started to become attractive to the Jews, what did the Jews find here? Was there anti-Semitism?
Well, let's start by what attracted them. It was smaller rather than larger. It was more comfortable culturally in the sense that there was not this tremendous Hispanic pressure of bilingualism. The school systems in Miami were changing dramatically. It became almost a necessity to be able to fight your way through certain things in Spanish. So it was a place. I'm not sure that for most Jews that it was a destination. It was someplace that they tried out. The first group for whom Boca really became attractive were the people who were wealthy, because the gated communities provided the lifestyle for which they would like to become accustomed, if you will. And it was only later that greater numbers of Jews began to move here, and they weren't in St. Andrews and the developments like St. Andrews, I would say Horseshoe Estates, but that actually came later. But those types of developments, more of them began to live where I live. My wife and I live in Estancia West, which is a gated community, but it has no clubhouse, it has no swimming pool, it's just a group of houses in a nice neighborhood. The anti-Semitism, unlike Delray, which had a long, long history of overt anti-Semitism, it was a place that many Jews knew not to stop on the way down to Miami because it was very difficult to find accommodations. The anti-Semitism here, maybe because of the higher level of education, the higher economic level of the general population, was much more, if you will, genteel anti-Semitism. There were clubs you couldn't go to all over Palm Beach County. It was noticeable that there were certain institutions, like the Boca Raton Museum, which had no Jews in their leadership and certainly were not looking for any. There was no real Jewish influence in the hospital. In fact, one of my Boca Raton HAC presidents was the very first Jewish doctor who was allowed privileges at Boca Hospital. That I believe was in the mid to late 70s. So you're not, historically, you're not talking about a long time ago when there was a wall, if you will. Maybe a mime's wall where you went like this and you went like this and maybe you couldn't exactly see it, but it was there. Were there incidences of overt anti-Semitism? Sure. Temple Beth El had been in the 80s and 90s had been defaced multiple times. There was a bright young reporter at the Boca Raton News who wrote an article that caused a furor. It was supposed to be funny, sort of a Dave Barry kind of funny. social humor. And it described a scene at a delicatessen, and it sort of picked apart little old ladies with blue rinse in their hair whose teeth couldn't quite chew the bagel, and the cream cheese was leaking out of their mouth, and many of them could be seen walking around with fluffy little dogs that were dyed the same color of their hair. It said nothing about Jews, but the Jewish community reacted like somebody had stuck it with a cattle prod. And in those days, if there were 2 bagel shops in town, I mean, now they're virtually on every corner, but and the diversity of the people eating in the bagel shops today is far different than it was then. So it was clear whether or not this person intentionally was taking a crack at Jews, that it was a Jewish venue and Jewish people that he was making fun of. So that's an example. There was...
How about real estate? Were there restrictions that you were aware of?
Royal Palm, across from the Boca Hotel, and the Boca Hotel was Judenrein for years and years and years until a Jew bought it. That's a little known piece of history from
what was the term you used?
It was Judenrein. It was devoid of Jews. Jews could not buy property in Royal Palm, not because there was anything, although some people actually, I think, found deed restrictions, but nobody came to you and said, oh, you're Jewish, it says right here, and you can't live here. It's just nobody would sell property. Mm-hmm. And friends of ours, I won't mention their names, were, I believe, the first Jews to buy a house in Royal Palm, and he was a very prominent doctor, and maybe they found him acceptable. And dotted around us were yacht clubs that Jews couldn't join. Most famously in Palm Beach County was the Everglades Club, which is in Palm Beach. You could not come to Palm Beach County and not know that as a Jew, this was not Brooklyn. You were not welcome everywhere. And there were more overt instances. I remember an article in the paper, describing a woman during the season. And for people who may be watching this in years to come and not know what the season is, really from after Thanksgiving until Passover, Easter, our population increases by over 30%. With what we affectionately, or maybe not so affectionately, known as snowbirds. The traffic becomes impossible. You can't get into restaurants. You can't get parking places. And there was an incident downtown on Federal Highway where I guess somebody cut off somebody else and slipped into a parking place. The woman who was cut off got out of the car and started screaming many things which I can't say here, and ended with, why don't you go back blankety blank to New York? Now, New York was, and I think in still quarters still is, a code word for Jew. The assumption is that all the Jews here are from New York. Some people call this Brooklyn with palm trees. It's not true, but in terms of impact, in terms of the accents that you hear, not so often do people still own 2 homes, but in the 80s and 90s, the place would be flooded with New York license plates. So the sense of you didn't have to scratch the surface very deeply to find something that you didn't want to encounter.
Why has this become so attractive to New York Jews to come to Boca Raton? Because we do know that they are a substantial part of the population, and you can't go to a book club, to a meeting, to a dinner with friends without that New York connection coming up. It's very prevalent.
Let's take that apart a little bit.
Sure.
President Eisenhower built the interstate highway system. You can look at the major cities of America and see populations of people who followed those highway systems to destinations they wanted to get out of. There are populations in and around Chicago came right out of Appalachia because of the building of those highways. If you go over to the west coast of Florida, the Jewish community and the non-native community, if you will, comes from the Midwest because of I-75. So it's not so much Jews as it is I-95. And the path that I described for you earlier. Once the original people were here, then you see a very normal immigration pattern. The grandparents are here, so the children and the grandchildren come and visit. And as the children get older, they say, you know, let's get a place so we'll have it for when we retire, because real estate's only going to go up. So people began buying property. Then I think there was a professional realization on the part of doctors, lawyers, accountants, dentists, CPAs, that their clients were here. And they started opening second offices, and then they started moving, and then they started having children, and then you had second and third and fourth generation Jewish families here, and the institutions that followed them.
What would you say then are the greatest changes that you've seen in the community, the Jewish community here, since you arrived in 1990?
Growth. Growth to the point where now institutions are competing, if you will, for membership, for money. Some institutions are already beginning to feel the departure of Jewish families and Jewish money to places north, West Palm Beach, Jupiter, going in actually all the way up to St. Lucie, and now we're going to begin seeing people, I believe, moving up to the Vero Beach area. The growth of the Boca Raton synagogue, which was really a tiny little nub of orthodoxy. The population, if you will, and then the population explosion of the Montoya Circle area around the Boca Raton synagogue, its growth to establish a day school, to establish a high school, the establishment of the Donna Klein Jewish Academy, the split off of B'nai Israel from Bethel, the growth of B'nai Torah from a little shul on 4th Avenue to the complex on 18th Street that it is. You've got a whole infrastructure, a Jewish community that cares for itself from cradle to grave. I think that the growth and maturation of the community, it really is the story. The current anxiety is radical Islam. There has been, in the last 10 years, a measurable growth of Islam here. There have been Homeland Security issues here We know for a certainty that there were people here who were actively involved in raising money for extremist groups. So this is not Brigadoon. We didn't come out of nowhere and will disappear into nowhere. This is the real world, and we're very anxious about it.
Two things. First, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the anti-Semitism of the 70s, 80s, the 90s. Do we still see that level here, or how would you characterize the community today in this particular issue?
I have an issue with the way particularly the media looks at anti-Semitism. In my years in South Florida, we have seen headlines that say anti-Semitic incidents jump 30%. Well, if I looked out my window and there were a 30% jump in anti-Semitism, I should see Jews being beaten up on the street and paint bombs being thrown at synagogues. But the reality is that of what the percentages are talking about are very small numbers. So maybe you had in a previous year 20 incidences that were cataloged as hate crimes dealing with anti-Semitism. So 30% in addition to 20 brings us to what, 26 and a half? This has not been, even in spite of the great Ku Klux Klan rally that took place in Boca Raton, I think in the early 90s, which was foolishness. This has never been an overt place or a place of overt anti-Semitism. This is a place with an undertone of anti-Semitism, and I think that particularly over the last 10 years, you have to dig down further and further to find that wellspring of distaste and dislike. I don't know if you've yet interviewed Commissioner Steve Abrams. You should. He was the mayor of Boca for many years, city councilman for many years. Steve could look at his election results and tell you where the Jews were, because he was elected with overwhelming Jewish support, and it was always in just a few zip codes. The further you got from those zip codes, the fewer votes Steve Abrams got. That's not quite as prevalent now, but it's still there.
The second thing I wanted to ask you about is you had talked, Mr. Gralnick, about this issue of this anxiety, the sense of anxiety with the growing diversity in our community, that this is not attractive only to Jews, that there is a growing Muslim population. There are several mosques here. And what is your sense of whether there are current tensions between the Muslim community and the Jewish community in 2015?
Right now, I would say that the overwhelming majority of both communities are either not crossing paths with one another or working to find ways to cross paths. There is a professor at FAU who sponsors a monthly interfaith gathering at his mosque. One of the mosques holds an annual dinner at the end of Ramadan, where it invites large numbers of the police community, the Jewish community, all kinds of communities. I would say the new mosque with the big dome on 4th Avenue is the least interactive. The problem for those who know, and I would sort of parse this into two pieces. The general community, I don't think is overly anxious about the fact that there are mosques here. They're anxious about what's going on in the world and the growing sense, particularly after what happened in Paris the other day, that anything can happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time. It's less likely to happen to you if you're in a small farming community in Kansas than it is in a community where there is a growing Muslim population. So that's a general angst, if you will. The people who have been professionals in Jewish life, the people who have been in law enforcement in this community for more than 20 years, have dealt with real threat indicators. Real people who have been found to be doing real things that were bad for America and were bad for Jews. It's hard to, I hate to put it this way, but look, what we're learning about Paris is almost all after the fact. It's incredibly difficult to keep an eye on everybody, because in America you're not supposed to keep an eye on everybody. So my ability to say publicly anything that would say, yeah, we really have a problem in this community, I can't say that. I could say it in 2001, 2002, 2003, but certain people left the community, and now there's a problem in some other community. What they left here, I don't know, because I'm not privy to that information anymore.
Before we run out of time today, and I do hope you'll come back and chat with us again so that we can continue this, but I did want to ask you about the fact that you were here in 2001, you were in a position of leadership, and when we had 9/11 in New York in 2001, what did that do to Boca Raton? What did you see here?
What I saw here was the law of unintended consequences. No good deed goes unpunished. A number of people in the clergy, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, felt it was very important to bring the communities together in a post-9/11 prayer and remembrance ceremony. If I recall correctly, it was held at St. Joan of Arc Roman Catholic Church. And the imam of the mosque at that time was given a central role. He was actually handed the Torah by a rabbi, and he read, translated a portion of the Torah. It was a wonderful evening. And then we began having Thanksgiving services that were tri-faith. And it turned out that that particular imam was being followed by the Department of Homeland Security. While he invited several of us into his home, and of course we were treated with typical Muslim warmth and hospitality and food and friendship, the fact of the matter is that while he was doing that, he was doing other things. There was to be a rally in Miami, an anti-Israel rally, and he was going to take a leadership role in it, and it was going to take place at the Holocaust Memorial on Miami Beach. And we went to him and we begged him, said, it's your right to demonstrate. Do it in front of the Israeli consulate in Miami. Do it any place. but don't do it in front of the symbol of the death of 6 million people, 1.5 million of whom were Jewish children. Couldn't dissuade him. And then later it turned out that the trail of money that was going to organizations overseas that turned into guns and improvised explosive devices led back to this individual. He's now somewhere in the Midwest. Once he was, if you will, unmasked, he took off. But we were left with egg on our face and the scary feeling that our Jewish values put us in a place that was very dangerous. I don't want to be overly dramatic, but in effect we were giving legitimacy to somebody who was aiding and abetting our own destruction, aiding and abetting the attempted destruction of the United States of America. And we did it with open hearts. And I'm sure those of us who were part of that have drawn a lesson that you really have to know who you're talking to before you start talking to them. You really have to have a courtship, if you will, before you're ready to tie any knots. And the future is what it is.
In that vein, there is a great deal of discussion and a great deal of concern today. Of course, with what's going on in Syria, we have a very large population on the move. There are people who are who have very strong feelings about immigration at this time, where, as we have just recently seen in Paris just days ago, there were people who were, as you're describing, people who were interested in doing harm, who were able to slip in the overall concept of bringing people who need a place to be and providing them safety, providing them a home, providing them an open border, basically, to bring them in there. What are your thoughts then as to what the community reaction is, or perhaps ought to be, with regard to immigration and the Syrian problem, given your experience in post 9/11?
Well, first of all, I no longer speak for the community. So I'm not going to answer that question.
All right.
I can tell you that we are a very diverse people. We have liberals, we have moderates, we have conservatives, we have our own extremists. I'm taking a course from a rabbi right now, and this question came up. He's an Orthodox rabbi, and he said, look, Jewish extremism is as bad as Muslim extremism. Extremism is bad, period. I remember after the Mariel boat lift, there was a Holocaust survivor, a woman in one of the condos in North Miami Beach, who her 15 minutes of fame was her vitriolic attacks on bilingualism and immigration, which just made me crazy, because were it not for the policies of the United States, she wouldn't be here. So I am sure that there will be anxiety, and that there will be a minimal number of people who will speak out against it. But we, excuse me, we as a people have brought millions of others into this country. And I think with the appropriate safeguards, the Jewish community will support continued immigration and refugee resettlement.
Thank you very much. We're going to leave it there for today, but I very much appreciate your taking the time to come to share your stories with us and your thoughts, and we'll look forward to renewing this conversation on another day.
Thank you.